And now it's my pleasure to introduce Julie Orringer and her book, The Flight Portfolio. In 1940, in Nazi-occupied France, Varian Fry, an American journalist, spearheaded a rescue operation. It involved obtaining passports and visas, be they forged or legitimate, and finding safe passage to the United States for an estimated 3,000 imperiled artists and thinkers. In this novel, The Flight Portfolio, we meet just a few of those people, such as Hannah Arendt, Marc Chagall, Max Ernst, André Breton, and André Gide. Other important figures of the time, like Peggy Guggenheim and Eleanor Roosevelt, also make appearances. But this is historical fiction, and as such, it imagines fictional characters too. Among those is Elliot Grant, a Harvard classmate of Varian Fry, who shows up in Marseille with a special request to enable the passage out of France of a brilliant young physicist who is the son of a very close friend. And as well as being the story of Varian Fry's courageous rescue operation, this novel is also a love story. With the invention of the character Elliot Grant, Julie Orringer poses further provocative questions about race, sexual preference, and artistic accomplishment, and the roles they can play in our assessments of who and what is deemed worth opportunity and survival. The Flight Portfolio, which gives the novel its title, is a portfolio of donated drawings and paintings by the great artists of the day, intended for exhibition in the United States to gain support for the cause and demonstrate what is at risk. Julie Orringer made a memorable debut with her award-winning collection of stories, How to Breathe Underwater. Her first novel, The Invisible Bridge, which was released in 2010, made her a literary star. This new novel, The Flight Portfolio, is a tour de force and has been well worth the wait. She will be in conversation this evening with Catherine Noel, who teaches at Johns Hopkins University, and whose first novel, Halfway House, was a New York Times editor's choice. Please join me now in welcoming them both to Politics and Prose.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. You can't. Is the mic on? Yes. It's on. Okay. Can we raise the level of the mic? Is this better? we're gonna raise the mic level and see if that helps a little bit, and I'll try to control my plosive P. Okay, well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and canines, for joining us tonight. I always love reading at this bookstore. It is a force for good in the literary world and in all of our lives. I first learned about it because my friend Andrew Sean Greer spoke passionately about this store because his mother was dear friends with the author of this incredible phenomenon that we know as Politics and Prose. And so I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to you all for coming. I'm going to read to you just a bit, and then Catherine and I will chat. I should say, by way of background, just so that we're all on the same page about this, that Kat and I have been friends for about 20 years. We're getting on our 20th anniversary of friendship, right? So the literary conversation that we're going to have tonight has been going on a really long time, and I'm really glad that you can all ask questions and be a part of it and join in at a certain point. So I'm going to read to you from the beginning, and when I ask my students to read from their work, I always ask them to read the titles. So I'm going to read some titles to you. The book is called The Flight Portfolio. The first section is called Despise What Is Not Courage, which is a line from an E.E. Cummings poem that Varian quotes to his wife later in the chapter. And the first chapter is called Gourd, which is a place name in the south of France. Gourd. Sorry. Okay. There was, as it turned out, no train to the village where the Chagalls lived, one of many complications he'd failed to anticipate. He had to pay a boy with a motorbike to run him up from the station at Cavaillon, 10 miles at a brain-shaking pace, along a narrow, rutted road. On either side rose ochre hills striated with grapevines and lavender and olive trees. Overhead, a blinding white-veined sky. The smell was of the boy's leather jacket and of charred potatoes, exhalate of his clever homemade fuel. At the foot of the village, the boy parked in a shadow, accepted Varian's francs, and tore off into the distance before Varian could arrange a ride back. Is the volume okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. The streets of Gord, carved into a sun-struck limestone hill above the Luberon Valley, offered little in the way of shade. He would have given anything to be back in Marseille with a glass of Aperol before him, watching sailors and girls, gangsters and spice vendors parading the Canebière. The Chagalls had only agreed to see him on the basis that he not bring up the prospect of their emigration. But what other subject was there? The Nazis had taken Paris months ago. They were burning books in the streets of Alsace. They could send any refugee over the border at will. At least the Chagalls had agreed. That was something. But as he reached the house, an ancient Catholic girls' school on the Rue de la Fontaine Basse, he found himself fighting the urge to flee. His credentials, if anyone examined them, amounted to a fanatic's knowledge of European history, a desire to get out from behind his desk in New York, and a deep frustration with his isolationist nation. And yet, this was his job. He'd volunteered for it. What was more, he believed he could do it. He raised his hand and knocked. An eye appeared in the brass circlet of the peephole, and a girl in a striped apron opened the door. She listened, strangling her index finger with one dark curl as he stated his name and mission. Then she ushered him down a corridor and out into a courtyard where a stone path led to a triangle of shade. There, at a bare wooden table, Chagall and his wife sat at lunch, the painter in his smock, his hair swept back from his forehead in silver waves, Bella in a close-fitting black dress too hot for the day. "Ah, Monsieur Fry," Chagall said, rising to meet him. The painter's eyes were large and uncommonly sharp, his expression one of bemusement. "You've come, after all. I thought you might. You won't forget our agreement, will you?" "All I want is your company for an hour." "You're lying, of course, but you lie charmingly." They sat together at the table, Bella on Varian's left, the painter to his right, he, Varian Fry, sitting down with the Chagalls. With Chagall, author of those color-saturated visions, those buoyant bridal couples and intelligent-eyed goats he'd seen in hushed rooms at the Museum of Modern Art. Bella filled a plate with brown, hard-crusted miche, soft cheese, sardines crackling with salt. She handed it across the table, assessing Varian in silence. "Had you been here a few days ago, we would have had tomatoes," Chagall said. "A farmer brings them up to the market on Thursdays. I'm sorry we don't have more to offer. The bread's a little hard on the tooth, I'm afraid. But c'est la guerre." "This is lavish," Varian said. "You're too kind." "Not at all. We like to share what we have." He gestured around him at the bare yellow stones, the rough benches, the shock of gold-green hillside visible through an archway in the wall. "As you see, we're living a quiet and retired life in our little dacha. No one will bother us here at Gord." "You have a studio," Varian said. "You're still producing work. That's what makes you dangerous." "Our daughter says the same," Bella said. "She's been saying it for months. But you understand, Monsieur Fry, my husband's reputation will protect him. Vichy wouldn't dare touch us." "With respect, Madame Chagall, I don't believe that for a moment. Vichy is subject to the Nazis' whims, and we all know what they're capable of. I've seen it myself. I was in Berlin in 1935, sent by the magazine I worked for. My last night in town, there was a riot on the Kurfürstendamm. The things I saw, men pulled from their shops and beaten in the streets, an old man stabbed through the hand at a cafe table, boys dragging a woman by her hair. These things happen in Germany, Chagall said, his tone harder now. They won't happen here, not to us. Let me speak to my friend at the consulate, Varian said. Ask him to start a file for you at least. If you do decide to leave, it might take months. Chagall shook his head. My apologies, Monsieur Fry. I'm sorry you had to come all this way in vain. But perhaps you'd like to have a look at the studio before you go. If you've finished, that is. Varian couldn't speak. He could scarcely believe that a person of Chagall's intelligence, a person of his experience, could fail to see what he himself saw clearly. Chagall rose and crossed the courtyard to a set of 10-foot-high blue doors, and Varian got to his feet. He nodded his thanks to Bella, then followed Chagall across the broken paving stones. Beyond the blue doors was a long, high-ceilinged room with a wall of windows, the former refectory of the girls' school. Canvases lay about everywhere, and for long minutes Varian walked among them in silence. As well as he knew the painter's work, he had never seen it like this, in its pupal state, damp and mutable, smelling of turpentine, raw wood, wet clay. From the canvases rose ghost-like images. A grave-eyed Madonna hovering above a shadowed town, serenaded by cows and angels. Crucified Christ wrapped in a prayer shawl, his head encircled by grieving sages. A woman kneeling beside a river, pressing a baby to her chest, clusters of red and white flowers rising like flames. It's no small matter to cross an ocean, Chagall said. More can be lost than canvas and paint. An artist must bear witness, Monsieur Fry. He cannot turn away, even if he wishes to. An artist can't bear witness if he's dead. The painter removed his hat and set it on his knee. The Emergency Rescue Committee mustn't concern itself further with our welfare, he said. Save your resources for those who truly need help. Max Ernst, for example, he's rumored to be in a concentration camp at Gurs. Or Jacques Lipschitz, my friend from Montparnasse. Who knows where he's fled to now? Or Lev Zilberman, who painted those massive murals in Berlin. Yes, I know Zilberman's work. Alfred Barr fought to get him on our list. You're not entirely on the wrong path, then. Help Ernst. Help Zilberman. Not me. And he turned away from Varian, toward his canvases, toward the brushes and knives, the wooden boxes cluttered with crushed tubes of paint. I'll mention your name among our circles, he said. I know plenty who are eager to leave. Varian stumbled along the road toward Cavaillon, down the hill he'd seen through the courtyard arch. It would take him 2 hours to reach the station at this rate, another 2 on the train after that, and then he'd be back in Marseille, having made no progress at all. And what would he report to his colleagues in New York, to Paul Hagen, who directed the Emergency Rescue Committee, or to Frank Kingdon, its chair? That summer, when he and Paul and Ingrid Warburg and Alfred Barr and the others had compiled their list, 200 artists, writers, and intellectuals who'd been blacklisted by the Gestapo and had no way out of France, they hadn't imagined that their clients might resist being helped, nor that they'd consider themselves beyond Vichy's reach. There were so many things they hadn't considered. His life in France had become a process of discovering them, often to his embarrassment. It was a miracle he managed to get anyone out at all. There'd been only 12 so far, a minuscule fraction of his list. What he ought to do, he thought as he kicked stones along the rutted road, was to write his wife that night, to say he was coming home. He'd confess, and what a relief it would be that his work wasn't going as planned. How had he imagined it would take a month, 1 month, to find and extract 200 endangered artists? He'd envisioned himself riding a rented bicycle through the countryside, rounding up refugees by the dozen, as if they'd be waiting in the lemon orchards with traveling papers in hand. He'd imagined that the consulate would contort itself miraculously to help him. But then the chaos of this place, the innumerable bureaucratic barriers, the cretins in the U.S. visa office, the resistance of the artists themselves. What a mistake he'd made crawling out from behind his desk at the publishing house, How could he have presumed to take the lives of men like Chagall and Ernst into his hands when he had no idea how to manage them? No idea even of how to convince them they were in danger. Eileen wanted him home. She feared for his life. Her letter from last week had made that clear. Well, home he'd go. He'd write her at once. He'd write her as soon as he reached the Splendide. I'll stop there.
Is this on? Okay. That was wonderful to hear. Can you hear me if I keep it here? Can you hear me? Okay.
I don't want to sit with my back to you guys. Yeah. We'll turn. We'll rotate.
Okay. So it's wonderful to get to hear you read out loud from this novel. And one thing that we talk about in writing that I would love to talk to you about is the idea of the creative beginning and the literal beginning. So the idea is that the literal beginning is the first sentences of the final draft of the book. It's the actual beginning of the book as you read it. But the creative beginning is where you start as a writer, where the book actually starts for you. And I wonder if you can talk about first, at what point the literal beginning of the book came into view, at what point you knew that you would begin with this moment when Fry is about to give up, and then also what your creative beginning was.
Okay, so by my creative beginning, just so I'm sure I understand, do you mean the origin of the book itself, or do you mean the beginning that I envisioned in the first draft when I sort of first started writing the story?
Why don't you do both?
Okay. Well, the origin story for this book is that my last book was a novel that was also set during the Second World War. It was called The Invisible Bridge. And in the course of researching that novel, I was learning about Herschel Grienspan, who is the young Polish-German-Jewish teenager who shot a member of the German ambassadorial staff in Paris in November of 1938, which was the event that the Nazis used as an excuse for Kristallnacht. Grienspan was the first who was extradited under the surrender on demand clause of the Franco-German armistice. And as I was researching the armistice, I Googled that phrase, surrender on demand, and up came a memoir by a person named Varian Fry. I had never heard his name before, not in all of my years of Hebrew schooling or traditional schooling. And yet it turned out that he had undertaken this incredible act of courage, had gone to France in 1940, and had ended up saving more than 2,000 writers and artists and intellectuals, Jews and anti-Nazis who were directly in danger of being placed in concentration camps or deported. So at the time, my thought was, oh, wouldn't that be a great aside in The Invisible Bridge, this incredible story that sort of ran parallel to these other stories that were driving that novel. But pretty soon I realized that Fry's story was much bigger than a paragraph or an aside or even a chapter. In fact, it was its own novel. This was kind of bad news to me at the time because I was excited about getting back to short stories after writing The Invisible Bridge. But in fact, the story was so compelling to me that I ended up devoting the next really 12 years of my writing life to studying and writing it. But interestingly, the beginning of the book, as I wrote the first draft, I actually read it last night at the Harvard bookstore, and it comes about, I may even still have it marked from last night. It comes a couple of hundred pages into the book, and it is a scene in which Varian is driving his yellow Packard. This is when he's a student at Harvard, and he's got this yellow Packard that was a gift from his father. He's driving it along a road in Concord. He's going too fast and enjoying going too fast, enjoying a feeling of power and a simultaneous feeling of a loss of control. And he ends up losing control of the car for just a moment, swerving toward an oncoming car, which then swerves toward the side of the road and ends up hitting a pedestrian and killing him. And that is something that actually happened, but that appeared in a biography I read in a vastly different form. And I spent one of the projects that I undertook at the Radcliffe Institute when I was there was to track down what had actually happened. And it was sort of a process of excavation that resulted in this other thing. But the beginning of the book, as it stands now, I came to much later as I realized that I wanted to drop the reader into a moment of frustration for Varian from the very start. One that was more of the present moment of the book, not a flashback, but something that was more closely linked to what was actually going on moment by moment for him in Marseille. And one that would sort of highlight how very difficult it was for him to undertake this larger-than-life job that he had accepted when he volunteered to go to France for the Emergency Rescue Committee.
Something that was so interesting, is this audible? Okay. Something that was so interesting to me hearing you read it, having finished the book, is that the idea of courage, which is that first chapter title, is one of the questions of the book. What does it mean to be courageous? And Fry, throughout the book, thinks of himself as a coward, which is such an interesting theme within the book, because obviously he seems so heroic from this vantage. Something that one of my experiences reading the book was that every once in a while I would put the book down and I'd go do research to try to find out more about these characters. And I was surprised several times to find either that somebody who was so almost otherworldly was a real person, and then a couple of times that somebody who felt so real to me was actually somebody that you had invented. And I wonder both how you decided to interweave fiction with historical fiction, and then also what the particular challenges were of having scenes between people who existed and people who existed only in your imagination.
Yeah, well, I think it was Picasso who said that the artifice of art exists basically to illuminate truth. Uh-huh. And that was the precept that I was following in all of my inventions in this book. I mean, I do feel like even when we're writing history, as fiction writers, we enjoy the privilege of invention. We enjoy that tool as a way of bringing a history to light and to life. Because Varian Fry's mission was so morally fraught, one of the things that occurred to me fairly early on in writing the book was that there must have been factors that were complicating beyond those that would have made it onto the surface of the history, onto the page of his memoir or onto the page of his biographer's works. I felt like there must have been personal factors that complicated his decisions about whom to save. And so in creating this character, Grant, this person who he was very close to when he was at Harvard and who then seemingly dropped off the face of the earth and then who resurfaces at the beginning of this book, what I think I was doing, I think the impulse was one of sort of literalizing that problem. In other words, taking that element of moral complication and placing it in the embodied person of a human being. I saw Grant as somebody who arrived at Varian's door with a proposition that he couldn't refuse because of his deep feelings for this guy, feelings that went back more than a decade. And yet I saw him also under strong compulsions to honor and adhere first to the mandate of his organization to save the writers and artists on his list. I mean, the interesting thing about that was that the list was a constantly expanding thing. It had originally been 200 people, but as more and more refugees started arriving at Varian Fry's hotel room door, and then later at the door of the office that he rented not far away, he began to question his mission almost immediately. He began to wonder whether, in fact, there was any justification for saving only this limited group of human beings. And so as he heard stories about what was going on in the camps, as he visited concentration camps in France himself, as he learned about the journey that a lot of these refugees had undertaken to reach his hotel room door, he kept adding more and more people to his list, much to the chagrin and eventually the anger of his organization back in New York, who kept saying, well, how are we going to raise the money for this? How are we going to get the visas for these people? How are you going to find a way to actually physically get them out? And he said, I don't care how. We're going to make it happen. We have to try because these people are imperiled.
And I think, too, and that leads into something else that I really loved about the book, which is the way that you're playing with scale, that you're working with life or death questions, but there are also moments when Fry is watching his lover walk away and he feels like he's dying because he's watching his lover walk away. And so one of the things that you're wrestling with in the book is that at times he's trying to do this huge and noble work, and all he can think about is his lover, as a human being does. And so something that was so interesting to me was when I read the front cover review of this book, which, congratulations.
Thanks.
Was that it was, in many ways an admiring review, but Cynthia Ozick objected to the idea that Fry had kind of personal feelings, and specifically she seemed to object to the fact that Fry was gay in this telling. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about at what point in your writing you decided to do that thing that you described, which was embodying some of his ambivalence in the person of Grant.
Yeah. Well, really from the very beginning. It was maybe a month or two into my research that I learned that Varian Fry was gay. I read about his relationship with Lincoln Kirstein while they were in college. And then I also read about his relationship with Stefan Hessel, the future French diplomat, and the father of the Occupy movement. Varian writes about Stefan Hessel in his own memoir and about the weekends that they spent together, kind of decompressing and retreating from the high pressure work of his organization in Marseille. And when I read about their time together and learned about his previous relationships with Kirstein, and then later read Hessel's own memoir in which he talks about his intimate relationship with Fry, there was no question in my mind. There was never a question in my mind about Fry's sexuality. I felt like I would have been violating the history if I had written about him as a straight man, even though he was married twice. He was married before he went to Marseille, and then his marriage fell apart over the months that he spent there. And he got divorced after he got back to New York. And then it was another about 9 or 10 years before he met and married his next wife. So, in fact, because I always knew that there was going to be this other character, I always knew that character had to be a man. I couldn't have conceived that person as a woman, because I felt like that was one of the disrupting factors for him. That was one of the elements of his time in Marseille that changed his life. And it was so fascinating to me that in response to the Ozick review, there's been this kind of outcry, both from the gay community, who's called attention to the fact that there were many histories of close relationships and intimacies and of losses that simply could not have been recorded because it was impossible for people to make those intimate lives public at the time, given the mores of the moment, and also from Varian Fry's son, who said, I figured out about 30 years ago that my dad was gay. And it really explained a lot about my own childhood and about his breakdown in the years following his return from France. He felt that his father's inability to live as he was intimately related to the difficulty that he had generally in finding a life that was satisfying to him in the world. So when you talk about those granular moments of personal grief that are nested in the larger grief of the moment, I mean, in a way, I think that the tragedies that we experience on a small scale teach us to apprehend large-scale tragedy, and they motivate our willingness to take action. If we know what it feels like to be separated from someone we love, then we will put our skins on the line, if we're also possessed of courage, to stop that from happening to another human being.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that the book does so brilliantly is it does fill in spaces between what can be known absolutely through fact and what can be known only kind of through intuition, what can be sensed as a truth. But I think that this is one of the wonderful and amazing tools we have as fiction writers, that we can actually enter into a consciousness, which is not something that really any other form is able to do. I think something that you said earlier, that this took up 12 years of your life, which makes perfect sense because it's so... The research that's gone into it so clearly is so deep. And I wonder, was part of the impetus to write it not just that Fry's story was so amazing, but were you pulled towards doing that kind of research, or did you feel dread at knowing how much research it was going to be?
Dread. Ever-increasing dread. Man, I think we must have had a conversation about it at some point where I just said, why did I ever take on the project of writing about a publicly known figure? I mean, it was so much harder than writing about my grandfather, right? The character in The Invisible Bridge wasn't really my grandfather. It didn't really turn out to be my grandfather, but that novel certainly started with his story. But no one was going to come up to me and say, he didn't have that relationship with that person, or he didn't go to that school, or he was never at that particular forced labor camp, because, well, maybe Tommy, his nephew here, who's here in the audience, would have known, but few other readers would have actually been able to hold me to that level of accountability. And so it was quite a different experience to take on Varian Fry's story when the historical record is so vast. And I kept thinking about his biographers. I kept thinking about Andy Marino and Sheila Eisenberg, and and the people who had spent years of their lives devoting their full efforts and their intellect to capturing their story, to capturing his story accurately. There's this. I was speaking to some new friends at dinner about this. There's this 27-box archive in the Manuscripts and Rare Books division at Columbia University that consists of all of Varian Fry's letters and photographs and telegrams and writings, drafts of his own memoir, and ephemera that have been painstakingly made non-ephemeral by the archivists at Columbia. I must have spent, years worth of time altogether, not just in 1 year, but over the course of many years, just sitting in that archive and going through these letters. Like, they're an infinite resource of detail about what his moment by moment life was in Marseille. I don't even know how he ever managed to write a memoir that's only like 250 pages. Except that I think he felt a real political urgency around it. He published that book in 1945, at a time when he really wanted everyone to know about exactly what had gone on the ground, and the kind of resistance that he met from the U.S. consulate, and the difficulties that he had from, not just from the French government, but also from the United States in getting his clients out. But yeah, you're right. It was just an absolute nightmare to just come upon fascinating source after fascinating source. And of course, there were living sources too. And then there was Marseille, and then there was Harvard. I mean, all these places that I felt that I needed to go to, to understand what it would have felt like for him to live through those years. So there really was a certain point at which I realized if I didn't stop, there was going to be no book. And I wanted this story to be told. Luckily, I don't work at my home where I could have kept 100 stacks of books. I work at the Brooklyn Writers Space, which is about a 10-minute walk from my apartment. And I have a teeny locker there that's like, that could fit like 5 books. And my nice blue ceramic coffee mug, and a stash of tea. And so I just started taking a couple of books with me and leaving everything else behind. But it took about 9 years to get to that point where I felt like I had sort of drunk in enough of his experience to be able to engage in a kind of act of selective forgetting, if you will, that allowed only the details that were really going to be germane to his lived experience to come to the surface.
So something else that I really love about the book, I talked about how you're playing with scale. And one of the things I love are the moments of joy that occur within the book, even though it's a book that could easily have been very bleak. And I wonder if you would be willing to read just a very short passage. This is from a party scene. It's page 205.
She told me that she was going to ask me to read a little bit from later in the book, but she didn't tell me what it was. So I don't even know what is on page. Let's see what's on page 205. I hope I have it right.
It could just be a random page.
Okay. No, got it. I got it.
So just so that we have time. Maybe just through the...
How about through here?
That looks good.
Okay, so this is the beginning of a surrealist dinner party on page 205. Just to give a tiny bit of background, this party takes place at the Villa Airbel, which is a house about half an hour outside of town that Varian and some of his associates at the Emergency Rescue Committee rented as a place where they could live, and also as a kind of refuge, a safe haven for some of his clients, his more endangered clients, who perhaps shouldn't have been seen hanging around on the streets of Marseille. It's this beautiful, picturesque villa. It doesn't exist anymore, but at the end of this book, in my author's note, there's a link to a URL. Well, you can't click on it, but there's a URL. But if you type it into your computer, you can take a virtual tour of this place. So I encourage you all to do it. It's really fun. The night of the party, the household sat to dinner at the large walnut table in the chairs carved with slit-eyed elves. Madame Nouget circled with a tureen of turnip soup enriched with cream from a contraband cow named Io. It's actually fun to read these lines aloud. I don't think I've ever read them aloud before. Who grazed the scrub fields below the garden and slept at night in a thatch-roofed shed at the property's edge. The turnips were the only vegetable in plentiful supply. But Madame Nouget had scared up some pale radishes and a pile of stunted potatoes that would have been discarded in peacetime. 2 feral chickens, caught by the quick-handed Hirschman, had forfeited their lives for the occasion. They lay at the center of the table in a nest of rosemary, their brown skins starred with flakes of Camargue salt. Varian could scarcely remember when he'd last eaten meat. The food supply in Marseille had continued to dwindle. The city lived now on its cellar stores or what it could drag from the sea. That and what flowed through the black market. He would never tell anyone when he'd paid for the chocolate that flavored the postprandial cake. On the table, flanking the 2 roasted chickens, stood a pair of large apothecary jars, into which Breton had decanted nearly a dozen praying mantises. His hope was that the mantises would perform their amorous rituals and that the guests would see the males lose their heads. Earlier, over cocktails in the library, Breton had presented Miriam with a brooch made from a pin-speared bumblebee. He'd found it dead on his windowsill that morning. Bravely, she wore it at the neckline of her dinner gown, where it rained a dust of pollen into her décolletage. She sat beside Varian, close enough that he could see gold grains on her cold-pricked skin. On her other side sat Walter Mering, pale and diminutive in a borrowed dinner jacket and a white silk tie, having managed for the occasion to overcome both his fake illness and his justifiable fears. Beyond him, in the hostess's chair, sat Mary Jane, patron, toastmistress, distributor of cigarettes and other favors, fanner of the conversational flame, and at her side was a scrubbed-looking Killer. That was her boyfriend. His nickname was Killer. In real life, not just in this book, in a sharp-edged dinner jacket. Beside him was Hirschman. That's Albert Hirschman, who later became the famous economist, Albert O. Hirschman. Every sign of chicken catching effaced from his being. Then there was Theo Benedict, tranquil as a young countess in her emerald-colored gown, and Danny, slim and correct beside her, brushed to a high gloss. The tall and wiry Serge Père et Fille, the nervous, broad-shouldered Jean Gemaling, molesting a delicate soup spoon with the ball of his thumb, Lev Zilberman assessing the assembled guests through the lenses of his tortoiseshell glasses, and a small host of surrealists from the neighborhood, Wilfredo Lam with his great inquisitive eyes and mannerist hands, André Masson, massive and direct, sporting a houndstooth cravat, the Spanish painter Oscar Dominguez and his one-eyed friend, Victor Brauner, Jacques Herold, whose paintings were as precise as they were strange, as if someone had turned a camera on Dante's Hell, and finally, at the head of the table, Breton, outfitted in a blue velvet jacket, smiling to himself as he surveyed the company. He was flanked by Jacqueline on one side and, to Varian's satisfaction, Marc Chagall on the other. Chagall, accompanied not by his wife, but by Harry Bingham, who had already begun to whisper in his ear. Next to Bingham, at Varian's side, was Grant, Elliot Schiffman Grant, in a sky-black dinner suit, the reunited Nautilus cufflinks at his wrists.
So I'm going to only ask you a couple more quick questions because I want to turn this over. I know that other people have questions as well. But is that scene something that you invented, or is that scene something that happened?
Well, it was something that I invented with pleasure. But it was based on many delightful details of surrealist dinner parties that Varian himself cataloged and that he wrote about to his wife in many letters in that Columbia archive, and that his biographers captured in their work. The Praying Mantises, Breton was obsessed with them. He had a collection of them that he kept at Herbel, and he liked to capture bumblebees. And there were constant, despite the shortage of food, there were constant raucous parties going on at Herbel. I think as a means for staying alive. I mean, I think that it was necessary not to forget about what was going on, because it would have been impossible to do that, but simply to engage deeply in another way of living just for a few hours. One that I think was kind of salutary, one that allowed a kind of infusion of hope in a way, because it made it possible for those refugees to envision what might be on the other side of all this.
And final question. One of the things that strikes me so much about the book, and that is present in that scene as well, is there's so many scenes about food. And usually food's scarcity, but occasionally like bounty, and how amazing it is when there is wonderful food. And I was thinking about this as I was traveling down here, because I know that you love food, and I was thinking about wonderful meals that we've shared, including one where we, you'll tell me if you remember this, we were sitting on a rock by the Pacific, and we were eating bread that had warm artichoke hearts in it.
Oh man, yes.
Yes. And then you showed me this trick for avocados where you prick an avocado, you cut an avocado in half, you prick it all over with a fork, and then you squeeze lemon in, and then you just eat the avocado out of the shell. It's very good. And so I wondered whether there was a meal in this book that you either have eaten and really loved, or that as you were writing about it, you wished that you could eat.
Wow. Yeah, it's really funny because I have one of my first readers, a friend of mine in Brooklyn, makes fun of me for this, for obsessively putting food into my books. But, I mean, okay, so I grew up in a Jewish household in a big Jewish family where there was this intense consciousness of what we were eating and when, and according to what rules, and in defiance of what historical shortages. And I always felt my grandparents' awareness of the plenty that we had in contrast to the little they had. And in fact, my mom, who emigrated to this country in 1956 after the Hungarian Revolution, described what it was like to walk into a grocery store for the first time and behold this almost unbearable plenty, or what it was like to go to Howard Johnson. This was like this experience that she described in detail, to go to Howard Johnson and to order this thing called a banana split that had like a family's worth of ice cream on top. It could have like nourished people for weeks. And these two bananas and these cherries and whipped cream. I mean, it's just like this incredible image in my mind. Like in my mind, it's like as big as a boat, And I think that might be how she perceived it when she ate it. So I did think a lot about what they were eating. I thought a lot about it because Varian talks a lot about it. And he and the other surrealists who were his clients and his associates kind of started to starve over the winter between 1940 and 41. And I thought a lot about how the moral decisions we make end up impacting our bodies at certain times, depending on the circumstances. If there was one meal that I was particularly that I thought about particularly, I think it was there's a town where Varian and Grant find themselves as they're trying to get a potential client out of a concentration camp. And for whatever reason, this town has managed to have a lot of clandestine stores, and the table is full of all of these unbelievable delicacies. And that's the meal that I would have wanted to eat. You can find it in the book, but not only because the food itself would have been amazing, but it's that meal that you eat after you haven't eaten for a while. It's like after you've fasted on Yom Kippur. It's the meal that reminds you of being welcomed back into the richness of life in a way. And I think that moment is sort of a turning point for the two of them as well, in a way.
So I'm going to get out of the way and... Okay.
We'd love it. We'd welcome it. Please don't be shy.
Well, I'll jump up rather than let there just be a dead time here. So, I'm interested in the moral aspects of things, so trying to make this really fast. It seems to me that, first of all, there's a moral issue when you go about drawing up the list. Yeah. Just, what are the criteria for the list? Right. But then secondarily, there's it sounds like in Fry's case, there's the fact that he's confronted with a situation where at least the list was drawn up presumably in some sort of systematic way, based on criteria that other than personal knowledge or personal, and so that's kind of another stage, a second, even more, perhaps more difficult stage in the moral thing here. So. Also, were there any engineers on the list? How did they go about doing the list originally and so forth?
Well, yeah, his list originally focused on artists and writers. And there were others in Marseille who were doing similar work on behalf of scientists and social democrats and prominent figures in the labor movement. And so these rescuers sort of had areas of specialization, as it were. But yeah, the original list had been drawn up by a number of different parties who had knowledge of who might have been particularly endangered and who also would have been, who also would have enjoyed a high level of achievement. But in Marseille, the selection process for new clients for the Emergency Rescue Committee was far more complicated. And in certain cases, it was complicated by the fact that so little evidence existed for the artistic merit that people were claiming. So in Hannah Arendt's case, for example, her recommendation really came from Walter Benjamin, who had known Miriam Davenport in Paris and who had been speaking kind of broadly about Hannah Arendt's dissertation, which was a thesis on the subject of love in St. Augustine. That was really the only basis upon which Varian Fry had to decide whether or not to support taking Hannah Arendt on as a client. Fortunately, her candidacy came before him at a time that his list had already greatly expanded. And so he took a risk on her, and that is why we have all the writings that post-date 1941. And then there were others who arrived at the Emergency Rescue Committee's offices there in France with no evidence, no artistic portfolio. Oftentimes what would happen is that they would be sent down to the port with a sketchbook and some charcoals and told to produce a few sketches and then bring them back up to the office. And then somebody with artistic knowledge, like Miriam Davenport, would take a look and would actually judge based upon, can you imagine, I give you a notebook and I say, Catherine, could you walk across the street and, observe a few people and write a little story and, bring it back for me to read, and based upon that, I'll just decide whether or not, yeah. I think it was incredibly fraught, and that quickly became apparent to him and to his associates. I think that it was not something that they could have witnessed for long without feeling like they had to change the process in some way. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for being here and for doing the reading. I have a question that sort of always comes up for me when I'm thinking about artists that engage across all mediums with historical fiction in some form or another, which is, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you navigate your responsibility to the historical narrative and to the truth. If you have situations where you really wanted to put your protagonist in a certain place at a certain time, but just said, I know he was never really there, I can't write that scene, etc. Or, or were times where you were researching for hours on end and, kind of felt frustrated and said, do I really need this, etc.
Well, the ethos that I observed in relation to that question was that I wanted anything that was known about his movements, his actions around Marseille, to be represented accurately. And I wanted also to be able to write freely in the areas that were unknown, of which there were many. By virtue of the culling that would have been necessary in order for him to produce the 250-page memoir he wrote, there was a lot about his time there that just wasn't recorded. And so even though we might not have known whether or not he went to Arles, for example, on a particular weekend, it was certainly plausible. I wanted to write within the realm of plausibility in those areas where the actual history wasn't known. But I did not want to represent anything that was known inaccurately. And that's because, this was a lived history, and it's a history that still exists in a few living memories. And not only that, but I think that in order to capture a story that isn't as widely known, generally speaking, as it should be, I wanted at least to come up with a rendering of it that would deliver real news of the world, and then also to be able to send readers to his biographies and to other non-fictional sources that would further expand our real understanding of this story. There were certain things, I was also talking about this over dinner, that I really wish could have been in the book, but there simply wasn't room for them. Like the fact that one of Varian Fry's constant companions in Marseille was a standard poodle named Clovis. He was black and curly-haired and just absolutely incorrigible. He couldn't be house trained properly. He needed like 7 walks a day. He was constantly biting at the clothing of important officials who would come to the house, and he just was highly. He was a really messy presence in Varian Fry's life, and I just loved him, and I just so wished that the book could have been 900 pages, so I could have just devoted 300 to Clovis. And he wasn't the only one. Mary Jane Gould, who was this American heiress who donated great sums to the Emergency Rescue Committee and who helped Varian Fry in his practical work there. She also had a poodle. His name was Dagobert, which I think is a great punning name for a dog in France in 1940. Some of her relatives wrote to me recently saying, "I'm so glad you wrote about Mary Jane. Is Dagobert in the book?" I had to say, "No, he's not. I needed another 100 pages just for him." So, yeah, thank you. Yes.
Yes. Last week, I saw a documentary as part of the Washington, D.C. Jewish Film Festival on Carl Laemmle, one of the major founder of Universal Studios. And I learned that he was able to rescue 300 people. And before I saw the movie, but that was in the blurb, 300 people, I went, 300 people? That was the best he could do as head of Universal Studios. In the movie, I discovered, yes, it was the best he could do because of our State Department blocking his efforts. And I think that his failure to save more probably contributed to his heart attack, which killed him at the relatively young age of 75. How did your group that you write about get 3,000 out?
Okay, so you bring up a really important point, which is that Fry's efforts were interrupted by our State Department. I mean, that was a major hindrance to the work, and that's a very prominent line in the novel from the very beginning. How did he get so many people out? He had one incredibly valuable ally, and that was Harry Bingham, who appears in that dinner party scene. Harry Bingham was a vice consular officer in the visa division of the U.S. consulate in Marseille. And in contravention of the policies that had been very clearly set out, he granted visas to so many of Fry's clients. He believed that the general U.S. policy, which was in opposition to the admission of refugees, especially those who had had any connection to the Communist Party or who had run afoul of their governments, even though these were fascist governments and the United States was soon to go to war against them, should be kept out of the country. Those policies were also directly anti-Semitic. That was a clear line that was, kind of tacitly in place in our public policy at the time. So Bingham knew that he was risking his career by granting so many visas to these clients. And in fact, towards the end of Varian's time in Marseille, he was demoted and he was thrown out of his position there. And he was never restored to the status that he held when he was in Marseille, even though he continued to work in foreign service for quite some time. So what's really incredible is that it wasn't just Varian. I mean, I think that this is really important for us to consider when we think about how personal influence works. I remember this job interview I had when I just got to San Francisco for a teaching job. And one of the questions I was asked in the interview was, what would you do if you had a terrible problem with a student that, was keeping you up at night and, and there was this hypothetical problem described. And I went through the process, I think I was 23 or something. I went through the process of how I would, consider all the factors around this problem and logically come up with a means for addressing them with the student. And I remember the interviewer shaking her head and just saying, in a situation like that, you ask for help. Of course I didn't get that job. But Varian Fry knew that when he went to Marseille at 35 years old. He knew that in order for him to do the work he had to do, he needed help. He needed Bingham's help. He needed the help of Mary Jane Gould, who was going to donate funds and recruit others to do the same. He needed Miriam Davenport, who had expertise in the world of art history. He needed the help of Danny Benedit, who had worked in a police prefecture and knew the sort of inner workings of the police state in Marseille. And everyone who he recruited to his aid had these special abilities that were outside of his own. And so it really was only through recognizing his own limitations that he was able to do the incredible thing he did,
So we are running very short on time. We're actually technically over time right now. But we have, I believe, 3 more questions here. If we could make both the questions and the answers very brief. Thanks.
Ooh, this is a good challenge. We're going to do question and answer haiku.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for your book. I found it a very emotional read.
Thanks. I will repeat the question.
Okay. My question actually doesn't have anything to do with Varian Fry. But as I was reading it, I noticed the word blue in your descriptions frequently. And I downloaded it to Kindle, and I searched on the word blue.
Amazing.
And I found 198.
Woo, that's awesome. Okay.
So my question is there a reason that you chose blue? I mean, your descriptions are wonderful, but the blue, is it your favorite color? Is it the Mediterranean, or did you have any connection to the color blue?
Well, my 5-year-old would tell you, the haiku answer to this question is that blue is my favorite color. The sonnet answer to the question is that when you look at images of that part of the world, both the paintings and the photographs, blue is the predominant color. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the sky, it's the sea, it's the quality of the air, and it's the flowers. And when I visited Marseille, that was the color that I really came home with in my mind. So it's amazing that you picked that out, because it was really something that was very close to my consciousness as I was writing the book. I noticed you're wearing blue. This is actually the blue section of the bookstore.
Yes. I grew up in Ridgefield, Connecticut, which is right next to Reading, and I used to play with Sylvia Fry when I was a child.
Wow.
And no one knew anything about Varian Fry until he died. I mean, in my town, we were so surprised when we read his obituary to read who he was or what he had done.
Right.
So his life in Ridgefield and in Reading was quiet.
Yes.
And I'm curious to know if in the materials that you read, if he kept notes or diaries or any of that time, if he just wanted to be a recluse or quiet, or if you learned anything about that time.
I did. What I learned was actually quite complicated. He basically suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder. And so a lot of what kept him from the world and from talking about his experiences was depression. Talking to his son about the sources of that depression and thinking about them from the reading I did, I think what really stayed with him was, of course, depression has biological sources. It has organic sources. But those sources compounded with his ongoing sense of frustration at not having been able to do more, I think really unmade him at a certain point. And I think he would have been the last person to want to trumpet his accomplishments when I think what really obsessed him was how much more he could have done. Mm. You know, he did write about his experiences, but I think a lot of people didn't want to read about them in 1945 when he published his book. They didn't want to think about the United States, for example, as having anything but a heroic role in that war. I think there was a general exhaustion in regard to the subject.
So this would have been in the 60s.
Well, he published that book in 45, but in the 60s, you know, it's interesting because around that time, he was still deeply involved with the Emergency Rescue Committee, which by then was called the International Rescue Committee. And it still exists. You should all donate to it. In fact, you donate to it by buying the book, because a portion of the proceeds from the book will always be donated to that organization. The life that he lived at that time was still connected to the work that he had done in Marseille. And if you Google the flight portfolio, go down past the stuff about this book, you'll learn that around that time he was actually putting together a compendium of lithographs called the flight portfolio. These were works on paper by some of the artists who he had saved at that time. And he was doing this to try to raise money for his organization, even then. So there was never a time in his life when he stopped. In fact, when he died very young, you know, at the age of 59, he was rewriting his memoirs, and we don't have those pages. And I've always wondered what he was changing. I've always wondered how he would have revised that story in 1960 and how he might revise it now. Mm. So thanks for your great question and for that connection. Thanks to all of you. Really, this was such a pleasure. Oh, one more question. Sorry.
Thank you so much both for reading and for giving me this chance to ask one last question.
Sure.
I asked my question as a newly admitted rabbinical school student.
Oh, great.
And I was very excited to discover that your collection, How to Breathe Underwater, was assigned in a class there on American Jewish literature.
Oh, great.
And so
okay.
I want to ask you if you see yourself as working in a broader Jewish tradition that goes back to the Bible and Midrash and all the way to the present, and if so, what that means to you and how that influences you.
Well, the haiku version, the version that I could give you standing on one foot, is that we're the people of the book, and the history of the Jewish people is a history of storytelling. That was the tradition that I was raised in, and there was never any question in my household that a book was not only something that could be read, but also something that could be made. And so while I wouldn't want to presume to say that I see myself in a line that originates with the Torah, I do feel that connection. I do feel like growing up in the Jewish household that I grew up in, I had a kind of permission for storytelling, and there was a kind of celebration of storytelling that went directly to the fact that every week when we went to synagogue, our presence there revolved around a story that was being told week after week after week. Thanks for the question.